Hello and welcome to today's webinar. I am Tyler Shields, Principal Analyst with Enterprise Strategy Group, and I have with me again today for round two of a webinar series, I have Robin Das, who is the Executive Director, Market Growth Strategist at DataBee, a Comcast company. How are you, Robin? Wonderful to see you again.
Yeah, it's great to be here again. Had so much fun on the first one. Just wanted to do a repeat, and let's see if we can make the sequel. Godfather 2 or whatever, Empire Strikes Back or whatever your chosen
Let's
better
definitely
second sequel is.
we'll definitely set the bar higher than Godfather 2. I think we can call it like maybe Star Wars or John Wick. Those sequels were
Oh,
much
there
better.
we
But
go.
today we're talking about continuous controls monitoring, which is an area very near and dear to my heart. An area I think we can dive into so much technical meat and market understanding and market knowledge that I'm very excited about this webinar. So to set the stage and to start level setting with the audience, let's take a couple seconds and help me understand the definition of continuous controls monitoring at a core, foundational, basic level. Um, how do you define CCM?
Yeah, and it's a great question, and it's an interesting one because you'll speak to audit teams, and they're like, "Well, we work continuously, so aren't we doing continuous compliance monitoring?" And you're like, "Well, no, I understand that you're not, doing an audit once a year and then sitting on a beach for the rest of the weeks." And so, I think that's a philosophical thing to first describe is like when we say, what do we mean by continuous? It doesn't mean that you're continuously doing audit work because we know you're a busy auditing team and you're always working, but it's more the continuous meaning when you're validating a specific control, is that happening in, call it, not an annual time, not a quarterly time? Is it happening in close to like literally real time, or as real time as you can get it, meaning like sort of on a daily basis, right? So that's the first piece is when we say continuous controls monitoring, continuous really does mean, real time. And then the second piece of it is really just, you know, the controls that you have in place. And so, that's sort of more standard to the audit team. But I think, do you have these controls in place and are you monitoring them? Makes sense to the audit team. I think it's that continuous nature, and the continuous nature being, always on and always being pulled, is kind of what I would talk about definition of CCM.
Sure. And what specifically from a CCM perspective, when we talk about controls, what is meant by the concept of controls? Specifically, is it programs, technologies, processes, people? How do we define controls when we talk about a continuous controls monitoring system?
Yeah, I mean, I think you sort of almost defined it because a control can be anything from a, you define it with all those things, right?
I
Some
defined it with the
controls,
question.
yeah, and I'm sure you've got some sort of thoughts on it as well. But I mean, it's all of those things. For some controls, it's just like an attestation, right? It's a yes or a no answer. Do you have this thing in place? Do you not have this thing in place? For other things, it could be an SLA or it could be a coverage area. Do I have MFA, multi-factor authentications turned on for my entire population, right? And so that, while that can be like a yes or a no, you could also have, yes, it's turned on for 95%, yes, it's turned on for 99%, etc. So I think it depends on the control, and to your point, it's all of those things.
Sure, sure. And there's a piece of that too that is like, is the control there? But there's also the piece about controls efficacy or effectiveness of the controls
Right.
that you have deployed, right? And so at Enterprise Strategy Group, we do a lot of surveys of CISOs and security teams and different organizational structures and things. And we did a survey the end of last year, which was our cyber risk management survey, where 26%, just a mere quarter of those surveyed, said that they have automated their review of control effectiveness, including performance and deployed security tools and processes. Only 26% of
Wow.
those we spoke to actually had that automated to the point where it was a continuous kind of running situation. The vast majority of them did point in time, one every n number of months, quarters, or years, where they would say, yes, we're effective as of this moment in time. But literally the next day that could change.
Yeah, and that's something we see a lot is this notion of compliance drift, right? Like you are compliant on the day that the auditors show up, everything's great, and then this is the real interesting piece of it is then the auditors go on to the next thing because again, as we said before, they are continuously working, so we wouldn't want to imply that the auditors aren't continuously monitoring, right? But then they're on to the next thing and they're looking at the next control and the next control and the next control. So the question remains like, well, what happens to that attestation? What happens to that control? While the auditors are not looking at it, and again, not through malfeasance or not through bad intent, but you know, certain things, the business priorities take over, and so are you looking at all those controls? Are you regularly sort of pruning those controls, or are you sort of looking at where you have MFA turned on, and are you able to even kind of get that data or not? And so I think that's some of the challenges that I think the automation is key, and maybe we have sort of misnamed continuous controls, and maybe it should be almost like automated continuous controls or something like that, like
Sure.
ACCM or just
That's
throwing
what
a
we
new
need. Yet
acronym.
another acronym. Yet
Yeah,
another
that's
acronym.
an acronym to learn.
So yes, and I've seen a lot of push recently around continuous controls and monitoring style of technologies and solutions that allow you to have a continuous program analysis, tools analysis, gap analysis, and all of the other security gap analysis that come with all the other values or outputs or features that come with the CCM style technology. But I have a few ideas what might be driving the now on this, right? Like why now?
Why
But
not?
I'd
Yeah.
love to ask you first, and I'll provide color after. But what's driving security teams today to look at CCM as a programmatic technology as opposed to 5 or 7 years ago?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a phenomenal question, and I think it's the usual suspects that we would sort of look to. That these macro trends that sort of drive these compliance trends, and so if you think about the shift to the cloud, right? So that's like a whole new world of controls and things I need to think about. If I think about work from home and that shift, and so there's again the sort of dissolving of before I had my perimeter and my firewalls and I had my castle and my moat, and then everything else inside was safe, and now that's kind of dissolved. And so with things like work from home, bring your own device, like there's that sort of second macro trend. I think not only has the universe expanded with the cloud thing, I mean, like IoT devices. So I need to kind of start to think about like, well, what are the other things in my network that are doing things, and like, are they controlled? Again, like the fact that sort of the internet is sort of the gateway to bad actors. Like, what is now connected to what else do I have in my environment that's now connected, and then so those I think would be the big macro trends, and then sorry, the fourth sort of outside the technology is probably just like the regulatory environment just continues to kind of get more and more complex as these three macro trends continue to grow. The regulations around looking at these things kind of will kind of grow.
Sure, sure. And I also feel like, and you kind of danced a little bit around this comment, so it's a bit repetitive, but I feel like we've entered an era where every piece of cybersecurity data is programmatically accessible, and all
Yeah.
pieces of infrastructure data and all pieces of like the configuration state of your tools, how they work, what they're seeing, like that's all accessible via software now. And it wasn't,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
Pre API era.
Yeah, that's a really great point. Yeah, the idea that you can kind of start to get data from all these different tools, and that can also give you more insight and sort of, I guess, before there was almost like a limit to sort of our knowledge, and we've suddenly like opened up a box of things we can now look at. So let's go look at them and make sure that they are compliant, especially as you know the bad guys or the things we'd want to keep secure are probably like looking at those things as well as like ways to kind of get in.
Yeah, I mean, and it used to be. I think the reason why we didn't see continuous controls monitoring really operating was because it was all human, right? Which you
Yeah.
which you alluded to at the top of this discussion. And humans don't scale, right? Humans have a certain amount of work they can do in a given day, and there's no You can't speed increase them by giving them bigger brains, like, or giving them better compute power, right? They just don't scale. And so now that we're entering this era of AI and agentic and large data, we're able to programmatically access all of the data set that those individual auditors and now analyzers, people looking at the controls in the program you have at place in an automated human way, are now able to see that infinitely quickly and make smart
Yeah.
decisions in an infinitely quick way. And if it doesn't scale, you can literally throw more memory at it, more compute at it, give it a bigger brain, and let it go even faster than before.
Yeah, and it's almost like to your point, and the stuff that we talk about, these macro trends of technology, before it was like humans keeping check on humans. And so that kind of, as you added more humans to your organization, you had to kind of increase your audit team. But when it's like now a bunch of virtual machines that also infinitely scale, in the cloud, or like I said, you can't have humans you can't throw more bodies at it. And so you need to kind of take a more data driven approach. You need to take a smarter sort of approach to kind of have the humans kind of overseeing what's kind of going on, but they can't necessarily be the ones that are checking or pulling samples because just the sample size is just so vast.
Yeah, the other thing I want to double click a little bit on here. You mentioned regulatory drivers.
Yeah.
Can you give me a little bit double click on that? I probably shouldn't use that buzzword, but let's dive a little deeper into the regulatory landscape involved in driving the CCM capabilities. What in particular within the regulatory landscape do you think is really kicking CCM, continuous controls monitoring processes, into high gear from an adoption standpoint?
Yeah, I mean, I think it kind of almost comes from the top down. If you take a step back, I mean, you think about the board, like I think maybe 10, 15 years ago, the board probably didn't think about risk as it pertained to like cybersecurity. They were probably thinking more like traditional financial risk. Do we have enough money to kind of keep running the business, et cetera, et cetera? And now, obviously, with sort of more high profile breaches, sort of cybersecurity is like, you pick your favorite stat, but it's either like the first or second concern of the board of directors of any kind of publicly traded company. And so I think from there it kind of flows down. So like I think you have these twin things of like it's on the board's radar, it's on regulators' radar, and so from there it kind of flows down. And so the board cares about it, and so they're going to turn to the C-suite and ask them, well, what do you have in place? And the C-suite's going to have to report out on it and like turn down and sort of see what they have in place. And I think the driver of that is the combination of the profile as well as like the regulators asking the board what they have in place. And so I think from a just a big picture, I think without diving too deep into any particular regulations, like I think those are the environmental factors that are sort of driving this. And then like then with the regulations, I mean, I think sort of your unveiling sort of new sets of regulations like PCI 4.0, enhanced HIPAA requirements, like all these kind of things are just kind of growing. Like the SEC cares about disclosures. Again, we're using the big R for like regulations writ large versus like a specific set of frameworks or regulations, but those things just kind of keep growing, and they also kind of think keep growing by industry. I think where it gets really interesting for the bigger companies is sort of the degree of. I think people sometimes think of regulations as being rules, and I think they're not necessarily like very prescriptive rules. They're more like frameworks and ways of thinking about the business, and so that's also open to interpretation and open to sort of how you sort of implement these kind of frameworks. And so that's where I think you sort of have this increasing sort of uncertainty, but also increasing
Yeah.
areas to kind of think about.
Whenever I hear of folks saying, we're XYZ compliant or 123 compliant, whatever the compliance regulation of the day is, I often want to tell them, look, compliance is not security. And I know that sounds completely backwards, right? When you people say, well, we're secure, we are, PCI compliant or HIPAA compliant or whatever compliance you want to look at. Compliance is really not security. Compliance is really and should be viewed as a baseline.
Yeah.
right? It's a
Yeah,
baseline of
absolutely.
security that's acceptable to the majority, the homogenized majority of companies, right? And therefore, it doesn't necessarily take into account specific risk balances that may be specific to your organization and at what level of risk acceptance you may have. But it's a, hey, let's at least set this minimum bar for all healthcare related companies that they will have at least this in place, right?
Right.
So the way I view compliance is that it's a baseline of security. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I mean, you couldn't be more right. Like it just doesn't equal security, and there's going to be and it comes down to sort of like the risk tolerance and how mission critical, like how mission critical is taking credit cards to your business. Like, like again, to use a silly example, like if you're a cash based business, well, we want to kind of have like the baseline, and then we don't necessarily need to do that. Or if we're not doing a ton of transactions via credit card, let's not worry about it. But then if the
That might
only
be
way that
acceptable risk, right? That
yeah,
might be acceptable risk, is what you're getting at.
exactly. If you're a bar, maybe you accept credit card, but maybe you prefer cash. And then like, if you're, a massive online retailer that does everything via credit card, like you're going to not only want to be compliant, you want to be beyond compliant, because if something bad does happen, like, yes, you were compliant, but still something bad happened, you couldn't take a credit card payment, right? Like that's you out of business. And so I think you're going to have to look at, yeah, like the risks you're willing to tolerate. And so yeah, to your point, like the compliance is the framework, the compliance is the guideline to kind of just get everybody to a minimum level, and then what they want to do above and beyond that is very much sort of predicated on the risks that they feel about a particular control or framework, as well as like the impact to the business that they might see as a result.
Yeah, it's interesting. In our research at ESG, we saw that 32% of companies say that compliance is the driving factor in how they prioritize vulnerability remediation, which is a little scary to me. But the other thing I want to bring up when it comes to a CCM program and compliance in general is the first C, the continuous piece of that, right? And another reason that compliance, in my eyes, is not security is that it's point in time, right? It's
Yeah.
whenever you execute that audit or that compliance assessment to ensure that you're up to that minimum level of security that the compliance dictates, it's as soon as you're done with it, you're out of date, right? Because
Right.
it's a dynamic environment. It's not a static environment that doesn't change. And so the continuous piece of it is also a big important piece on how compliance can become more security related, right? By executing
Yeah.
compliance in a continuous way, it's much closer to being an actual security program.
Yeah, no, that's actually a really great point. Is that it's like not only, do you have MFA sort of deployed across your population, yes or no, or across 90% of your population, yes or no? Like what's really interesting is if you can be like, it's 90% deployed today, and we don't have to wait another 3 months to find out if we passed our audit again. Like we can constantly monitor it by having all that data. We can kind of have the dashboards in place to sort of see how things are trending, and actually sort of we can then with the continuous piece of it, and we can kind of get into like some of the underlying technology to kind of enable that, is like we can also say like, well, we know that to be compliant we need 90%, but actually should we be more concerned about that 10% that isn't compliant? What is that 10%? Let's go dive in there, and actually let's keep improving that, and let's have a mechanism to not only make sure that we stay in compliance, but we actually go above and beyond the compliance. And you can only do that with sort of the data and that sort of continuous monitoring, because then you kind of have that feedback loop, right? Like you can, like if you're just waiting once a quarter or annually to kind of understand whether you're doing better or worse, well, that means you can only improve once a quarter or once a year. But if you've got like up to the minute sort of dashboards, if you do something and it starts to make the number go up, well, then keep doing more of that to make the number go up and get your increased compliance. And so you've got that feedback loop, that sort of instantaneous feedback loop that's going to enable you to drive the change across your organization. And so again, you can set your baseline at 90%, but heck, why not use use this reporting and these tools to then go above and beyond that. You're already in compliance, but go above and beyond that from a security perspective and ask those questions of like,
Yeah,
well, what's in that unknown 10%? We said we wanted to be 90% compliant, but what
sure,
is in that 10%? And can we go make that better?
sure, sure. It's very interesting. I want to shift gears a little bit here and talk about the challenge itself and think about CCM capabilities and pain points that are being solved by CCM technologies, right? So, um, continuous controls monitoring is essentially a way to build a program, right? You
Yeah.
look at what controls you have in place, where your gaps might be. So it's very clear that one output would be the ability to look holistically at your cybersecurity program, look for gaps in your program by leveraging both your technology, current state of your technology, current state of your risks, and kind of coming to a recommendation there. If we were to attempt to enumerate the key feature, not features, but like value that a buyer would get from implementing a CCM technology, out like what would the top two or three challenges being solved be?
Yeah, I think the first, I mean, maybe not in order of importance, but just, I think because these are all equally, potentially equally important. I mean, I think the first thing is like we were talking again about auditors working continuously. Well, what are they working continuously on? Like, are they doing sort of a bunch of manual work in Excel spreadsheets and VLOOKUPs and stuff like that? Well, hopefully not, and hopefully that's alleviated by this more continuous controls monitoring platform, right? So instead of having to do a lot of time on pivots and VLOOKUPs and all that type of stuff, they're actually doing more strategic work. And you don't necessarily need to expand sort of the audit team as the business scales. And so that I think that's like sort of to me like one of the first things. But I mean, I think you hit on another thing of like it gives you sort of that gap analysis, so you can kind of see where your gaps are. I mean, the other thing that I think you also get from a sort of programmatic approach is especially if you can add additional pieces of context. You can begin to
Mm,
understand. If you add this like additional context, you can kind of begin to understand like like who owns it and like start to sort of assign ownership of these things, as well as like a ranking of like of the gaps that you have, right? And let's be, we're sort of amongst friends, and so we know that any team is going to have gaps. Any organization has gaps, right? But which do you tackle those first, right? And so if you have this additional context, not only can you get more of a ranking as to like how severe and like what's my level of risk on each of these gaps that I have, you can also begin to use these. Another pain point is like the ownership, like who's responsible now. I found this problem. Who's responsible for going to fix it? Like the person that finds the problem is not the person that is typically the person that can also fix the problem.
yeah. So there's a word that keeps coming up in our discussions on this webinar, in our previous webinar, in our offline conversations. We very frequently use the word context, and context. I think, in my opinion, context is the word of cyber for 24 and 2025. Right? It is the key word because fundamentally, context is what humans do. Right? They pull in large quantities of data and they look at things in context of other things and make connections with that data and in their brain visually or mentally or even auditory, I guess, doesn't matter, but somehow connect those pieces of data together to create a contextual awareness that is greater than any individual data point, right? So I'm going to actually kind of call back a little bit to our previous webinar and ask a question about your view on the data explosion that has really occurred in cybersecurity, right? I alluded to it up front about everything being API accessible, the ability to pull
Yeah.
the state of any technology in your stack, the state of your security tools, the state of even people, right, and code. So, how does the data explosion that we're having today in cybersecurity, does that help or hinder the ability to deploy effective security controls for the average enterprise security team?
Yeah, I think it's kind of this. You sort of have to go through a journey, right? Because I think in the initial piece of it, it hinders it without a doubt. Because all of a sudden you have all this data, and you kind of feel this like need to like, well, what do I do with all this data? Like I have all this data, I should do something with it. Like it seems that there's value in here, but then it's overwhelming. And so I think on the first piece of it, it's kind of it's hindrance, And then I think over time, every organization has to sort of mature and go from sort of being sort of nascent with the data to actually sort of having a mature view of the data, which is like you've got to find tools or mechanisms or ways of dealing with this data. And to your point, adding the context and sort of aggregating it and doing the so what with it, so you can actually do something interesting with the data. So you can add the context. So you have all this data, and then you add in additional pieces of data, right? So it sounds like you're adding to the problem because you already have too much data. So you add more data to it. But actually,
Right.
that's the way that you kind of get through it. Is well, I, you sort of have you pull out the data, you add the context to it, you sort of normalize that data, you put it into a common language, and then you can kind of use that to drive insight by some of the examples of context, like if you have a list of assets, like the owners of those assets, right? That's an element of context, right? Another element of context is not only do you have the list of assets, the owner of those assets, you have the function of those owners, right? Like, so you can begin to look at, develop, if a guy's in sales and he's sort of owning a lot of like sort of development, servers, like you'd have to ask like, what's that guy doing? Or if he's an engineer or a developer, well, it makes sense that he has those. So, you begin to like answer more and more nuanced questions of your data. And so in the long term, if once you sort of mature your data approach, it is definitely a boon. In the short term, it could be a hindrance because of that data explosion.
Yeah, it's interesting. In our research at ESG, it was the third most important factor that was adding to the complexity of security operations was the collection and processing of more security data today than 2 years ago. So
Wow.
the
Yeah.
majority of companies that we speak to basically say that that's driving significant complexity in security operations, making it harder for us to do our day-to-day journeys. But I think if you can wrap, and the key term I like to add here is automation, right?
Yeah.
It's making it difficult because when you have piles of data and only humans to work through it, it's a scale problem. So you can solve
Right.
that with automation, and if you can make that automation highly effective and fast enough, you can see reductions in amount of times to fix problems, and you start to see the actual growth curve that comes from having that added context over time. And you're right, you have to grow into it.
Yeah. I mean, the analogy, could be that you have like, 100 different languages. So you have to understand, like, if you as a person, you suddenly have to understand 100 different languages. Like that's a hard burden, right? Because you have all these tools talking at you in these different languages. Well, that's again to your point of like where you use technology. So if you have the 100 languages that kind of go through, the Star Trek Universal Translator, um, and then all of a sudden they're speaking the one language, well, then like life gets a lot easier because you're only having to read one language. And I think that's the point is that you need a layer to kind of translate all these different languages into the one language. And then once you're looking at it in the one language as a human, you can like add those additional pieces of context and so what, and then yeah, and then you're sort of off to the races.
So Databee, which is your
Yes.
company, which is a Comcast company,
Yeah.
does exactly that, correct? Right? It collects, correlates, normalizes, deduplicates, and surfaces cybersecurity data in a way that can fulfill on a lot of different value propositions. So let's change it up a little bit here and jump into the data fabric storyline. I want to connect it back to our last conversation. Most of
Yeah.
what you just spoke about is essentially a data fabric, right?
Yeah, and so compliance is a really powerful example of what you can achieve if you have that data fabric. But yeah, at its base level, you know, we're extracting the data, we're putting it into this common language. We would call it normalization, but we're putting it into this common data model, a common data schema, and then from there, now that all the data is like in this single source of truth, it makes compliance sort of a much easier ask because not only are you pulling that data in constantly, right? So we can kind of get to that continuous piece of it. You now have this flexibility when it comes to implementing the frameworks or even the regulations. So, for example, you know, as the regulations change, you don't suddenly need to kind of throw out your old tool and get a new tool. Like, the top level regulations might change, right? but the data that it's pulling, the single source of truth, where you're going to look for those answers stays the same. So it could be, to use a silly example, it could be like maybe the regulations, were 90% of your population needs MFA, and then maybe the regulation changes to 95%, or it needs to be MFA on both, your laptop and your cell phone. Well, you're already pulling in all that data, so it makes life very easy to just kind of expand the dashboarding, and that's kind of the more trivial piece of it. The hard part was getting that data, which is only available to you from a data fabric. And if you had a specific point solution that was like looking at where do I have MFA turned on my laptop, and then all of a sudden these new regulations come up that say like, well, it has to be on your phone. That's the challenge. When you have a data fabric in place, you're already collecting all this data, and so it becomes very flexible with like, okay, we need to change that from 90 to 95%. We need to change the coverage universe. Easy, done. Like,
Yeah.
easier and
I
sort
look,
of done.
yeah, I look at it this way. When I think about compliance in that way, you can almost simplify it and say, what is compliance? Well, compliance is just asking questions. Are you
Yeah,
X or do you have Y, right? And
right.
if you have a system that is always up to date or nearly always up to date or in a near real time capacity is pulling all of this data into a big fabric that's queryable in an easy to query way, it's like the perfect foundation for asking questions, right? Because
Yeah, exactly.
inside of this fabric, you have all of this information about your endpoints and vulnerabilities being discovered and where 2FA exists on what accounts and who owns what, and all this is weaved into that graph base, that knowledge graph,
Right,
right?
that knowledge
So
graph. Yeah,
the overlay of asking questions of it is so natural. It's such a natural fit, and your questions can change, which is really
yeah,
cool because now we get to see the connective tissue between compliance, which is a point in time set of questions. So once a quarter, we will make sure that these questions are all checked green.
right. Yeah,
What's the difference between that and CCM? It could be the literal same questions or even a better group of questions, and it's not a point in time.
yeah.
Foundationally, that's the difference between compliance and CCM.
Yeah, and I think that's spot on, right? It's that you're always able to ask the questions. You're able, I mean, in some ways, you're always able to kind of go back and see how your questions, how the answers to those questions have changed, right? Like that's important, and that there's continuity between that, and you can only kind of get that if you're collecting all the data, if you're putting it into the same format, and
And even to improve the questions you ask. So
yeah,
today you might have a set of 10 questions that you want your security team or your IT audit team to make sure that they've checked off. Tomorrow you can say, wait, but we've got a gap on this security control now. Let's add a few more questions and make sure that we drive right. So that question and answer approach on top of a knowledge base of data not only gives you the ability to confirm or create yes or no checkbox compliance, but also to create programmatic improvements over time as you identify gaps in the environment. Let's I want to go to another question here because I want to make sure we get all of the awesome discussion points in. I want to talk about creating a shared culture of compliance. Help me understand what that concept means. Like, how do we convince security teams or IT teams or even technology teams or even users in a general sense, right? How do you create a shared culture of compliance in a enterprise or inside of an organization?
a great colleague of mine keeps talking about compliance being local, right? And when he means by that is a lot of the questions you would ask of certain pieces of data, like a typical one is like access rules, like who has access to what systems, right? Now, the person that's going to know that is going to be your manager, is going to have a much better sense of that, is going to be your direct manager than sort of the sort of removed audit team that's going to have to ask your manager anyway. So, can you make your manager know, or can you make your manager aware of these questions, or these access requirements? And by having this single source of truth, um, having this clean set of data, it enables you to sort of democratize these dashboards or these views of data, and enable the local teams. Who's going to be more effective at making you do a compliance training? Is it going to be some unnamed auditor, or is it going to be your manager? And what drives teams to kind of compete each other? Sometimes like a little bit of healthy competition. And so if your manager and his peer can see your results, and your results are doing better, like that sort of healthy competition, that sort of gamification, if you will, of compliance can really make it both a team sport as well as like expanding it to make it this sort of shared culture of compliance. And now you, in theory, could maybe do that with certain tools, but you kind of need this continuous control. You need this data constantly flowing in because, again, back to this feedback loop, like teams want to know if I do X and will I see Y immediately? And we kind of live in this world of instant kind of gratification. And so, yeah, the idea that, like, hey, guys, make sure you do your phishing training because we're trying to beat, the West Division. We're in the East Division. We want to like just beat them because there's a healthy competition there. Like let's do that, right? And so you can kind of, again, you can start to gamify these things. You can kind of create like a healthy sense of competition.
We talked a bit about security data fabric, the challenges that can be solved to make an effective CCM, right? Um, so talk to me a little bit about how does CCM work with, kind of in concert to or alongside traditional IT systems like CMDBs? Um, does it augment them? Does it kind of displace them, right? Does it rely on CMDBs? Like, talk to me about how an asset database inside of a cybersecurity data fabric that's providing continuous controls monitoring would work alongside or with or in conjunction with like a traditional CMDB system.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. So, and I think there's a couple of different answers. I think from a certain perspective, you always want to kind of go to the source of truth, right? And so, yeah, like if you have a source of truth like CMDB, let's kind of go there first and use that to inform, what it is we're doing. However, we all know in sort of big organizations, any system of record almost kind of is kind of out of date, sort of because things change, and so whenever you pull it, things will constantly change, and so sort of relies on a lot of people updating a lot of things, and you sort of have all sort of errors that kind of go into these systems, um, just just naturally over drift and time, and so you want to use these systems as a starting point but not the end point, right? Not the Even though they are quote unquote the system of record, you kind of want to use them as your sort of almost like a baseline, but then you want to supplement that with additional pieces of context, as well as like filling out the missing pieces that the system of record sometimes doesn't capture.
Sure. We
And
compare and
sort of,
contrast in that mode, meaning we
yeah,
look at both and kind of deduplicate and normalize both those data sets to kind
exactly.
of come up with a superset.
Yeah, and exactly because, for example, like if you think about like asset ownership, right? It relies upon the owner of that asset constantly kind of not constantly updating, but like remembering to update these assets, right? It relies on when Team X shifted under Team Y, there was like a reorg, and these assets went away, that people remembered to kind of update their assets, or they, and it's reliant upon people putting things into systems, and whenever you're reliant upon people putting things into systems, there is going to be error, and so again, by comparing and contrasting different pieces of the system, and a data fabric should be pulling in multiple pieces of data to literally just sort of triangulate, right? And so by things like asset ownership, just say, for example, like they left these assets as unknown, right? Or just say there are sort of shadow IT groups that have brought on a bunch of assets that the main IT group didn't know about. Like there's all sorts of complexities when we're talking about the enterprise, all sorts of edge cases, and so the more data you have, the more you can kind of triangulate against that, and sort of nail sort of and minimize the amount of error in any one
Sure.
particular system.
Sure. Yeah, no, I love that. And I think it should be by this point abundantly clear to the audience how CCM works and how it really does require a broad data contextual layer to live underneath
Yeah.
it that's continuously updated programmatically in an automated way. So for the last 5 minutes we have here in this conversation, I want to dive into two things. One, I want you to help me understand the implementation side of the house. And then we're gonna follow up with the final question, which will be about futures, which is always the most amazing way to finish these
Yeah, it's
conversations. So
always
let's start with implementations, right? What should a security organization consider implementing a CCM tech? What should they consider before jumping into the deep end and buying a tech and trying to roll it out? Like, what do they have to be, I guess, cognizant of when they want to roll out a CCM program or technology?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing is probably the flexibility of the underlying platform they're buying, right? Like because I don't think no two organizations are the same, and so no two organizations' compliance and frameworks going to be the same. And so anything that kind of rigidly adheres to a particular set of frameworks is sort of doomed for failure. So I think number one, it's the flexibility, as well as the fact that things will evolve over time and regulations will evolve over time. So I think you want to think about flexibility, and I think you want to think about the sort of onboarding and maintenance of these data feeds. So, for example, like if you want to build it yourself, that's a way that you can go. But remember, like when underlying data mappings change, when especially if you're relying on vendor tools and those are things that are informing your environment, if those mappings change, those data fields get augmented, you're going to have to maintain that because otherwise, all of a sudden, things are kind of going to break. So I think that's those would be some of the things that you need to think about with implementation, as well as sort of a team with a proven track record that's sort of done sort of implementations before at large enterprises.
Got it. Got it. So it's kind of just make sure you're planned into it. Don't just fire from the hip. Actually put some planning behind it and make sure you know how you want to roll this thing out.
Yeah, exactly.
So if I do that, if an organization does that and they roll out a strong CCM program, do they get to throw away their GRC? Do they get to throw away their
I'm not
compliance
going to
tool?
commit to anything. I am. I mean, I think what you can do is you can uncover by having all the data coming in. I think you can kind of uncover tools that maybe you had overlap with, right? You can uncover suddenly again if everything's now all speaking the same language, you can kind of understand like would two of these things repeating themselves, and so maybe you kind of can get rid of those things, and so maybe you can realize some savings, or maybe you can kind of realize that you were getting the same answers from like three different tools, so maybe we don't need all of those tools. And so I think you can kind of rationalize without necessarily sort of getting rid of. And I think it also means maybe you can actually realize more value because maybe you have these three different tools, and maybe tool A was actually telling you multiple things that were useful that you weren't even thinking about, right? And so maybe it kind of enables you to get more value out of your existing tools as well as like rationalize some of them.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. I don't think it's a throwaway GRC moment, but I think you should be watching those tools closely, understanding how they augment or feed off of each other, see which ones can get closer to the automation and continuous pieces of what you're shooting for, right? And if you can achieve similar goals with two separate tools, it makes sense to turn them off. But if there are feature sets that augment one another, you should definitely consider making sure that they play nice together in the playground. So I do want to ask one final technical question on that. Then, what are the outcomes or the metrics that we want to see on CCM? Right? Like, I think CCM, in a general sense, if I'm going to talk about continuous controls monitoring, it's your traditional risk reduction metrics, it's your dwell time, it's your how long vulnerabilities or issues are remaining in place. Like all of those traditional threat and exposure management style metrics become important, but also programmatic broad gaps, right? So do we have a control for this security risk that we hadn't thought of, right? And those metrics elevate in value as well. What other metrics might I be missing?
I mean, it was a pretty great list.
Pretty
I mean, I
exhaustive
think,
list.
yeah, I mean, I think there's like sort of the metrics behind the metrics without getting too esoteric, but like the when you talk about the gaps, what are the gaps I should go to first, right? Like, so you can start to kind of answer again by adding in this context. Like, you can start to do that. You obviously want to shorten your sort of SLAs on vulnerability management, patch management, all those types of things. Like, you want to kind of start to lower those times. So there's going to be like the standard set of metrics. I think, yeah, I mean, I think those be some of the things you begin to kind of uncover the gaps. And then I think you also move into like the idea of like the unknown, unknowns, right? Like, can you start to now, it's almost like a shifting of focus and budget and priorities is like now that you've kind of got the known unknowns under control, can you actually shift to the sort of more, out there pieces of risk that might catch you more unawares? And, for example, we talked a lot about cloud. What are we doing about containers, right? Like the rise of containers and microservices, and like, where are we on that? Like those should be the next sort of frontier of what we're thinking about, and kind of frees up, in theory, if you're doing this program correctly, a lot of the stuff starts to kind of take care of itself, and it kind of becomes embedded in the DNA, and it does free up the team to kind of start thinking about these more exotic forms of risk that may not even be on the radar yet.
All right, we got 2 minutes left, and I want
Okay.
to pull out the crystal ball and shine it up real quick here, and I'm gonna ask you a futures question. In 5 years, what does CCM Technologies look like after we've gone through this transition to AI? How does AI really affect CCM Technologies in the next 5 years?
It's a great question. I
The best
think
thing about this question, Robin, is it's impossible to know if you're right or wrong. So the audience is
I'll
just
put
going
a
to have to believe
calendar.
what
I'm
you
going to
say.
put a calendar invite for us to speak again in about 5 years, and
I love
we'll
it. Tell
see
me
if
what
this
you
is
think.
see if this is right or not. I mean, without a doubt, like the AI is going to have sort of a fundamental sort of impact on CCM. I mean, I think there's sort of setting AI to work on thankless tasks, right? So what do I mean by a thankless task? Like, I have a list of assets. I know the list of assets and the owners of those assets are going to inevitably not be accurate. Can I set the AI to work to kind of go and make sure these, assets are sort of updated, and do I have clear ownership, and do I know who owns what? Again, more thankless tasks of finding all my vulnerabilities and helping me rank my vulnerabilities and suggested next actions of the vulnerabilities I'd want to kind of tackle. I mean, if we can do it for Netflix and like, people that patch this also patch that, like why, people that watch this also watch that. Why can't we do
I
it with
love
like
it.
people that patch this also patch that?
Yeah.
And so sort of a more predictive ability. So definitely want to use the AI to kind of do both the thankless tasks as well as like the next best action. I think those would be two sort of areas I think that we really really need the help in. And then yeah, I mean I think I think sort of having the ability to kind of, again, back to your point about ask these questions, you know, being able to kind of interpret the questions that we want to ask versus it being sort of more program based or something, like we can actually ask those questions, how risky are we? Like, and then the AI would kind of be able to kind of ask some follow up questions to kind of understand, or when you say how risky are we, or like how incompliant are we, it can kind of begin to kind of drill down into like what is it you're actually trying to get to, and sort
Yeah.
of find you that data.
Yeah, it wouldn't be fair for me to ask that question without at least attempting an answer of it myself.
Yeah,
And I agree with you. I agree with you completely, right? I think the data collection side of it will continue to get more intelligent in the sense of, hey, we just saw a new control pop up that your team put in place, and the AI agent is able to find it, detect it, pull data from it automatically without even being told it's there. And then from there, the data analysis becomes more and more holistic and specific to you as an organization. And sure, we'll see improved remediation times for vulnerabilities and get preventative and predictive and have all of that stuff in play. But I think from a CCM perspective, it gets really interesting when a new company or a company with one person on their security team goes, I have no idea how to do this. And the AI goes, I got you. Let's do
yeah,
this today, this tomorrow. Now we're collecting this data set. We're going to add this the day after. Oh, and by the way, you told me your budget is only X number of dollars a year. here's the open source versions and the lightweight, risk reduction. Like, I think that's when things are going to get super rich and fun, when it really helps everybody improve and level up the programs they've got on the broadest sense. So I'm very excited for the future.
Yeah, I think, and even sort of playing off of that, like the idea that you kind of have the AI sort of interpret the regulation to your business. Like, yes, you can pay somebody to kind of, compliance teams, and you can kind of get the auditors in to kind of like interpret it for you. But like, if you could have the AI that's kind of trained on you and your environment, your company, to kind of interpret, well, actually, this is what that regulation, or this is what this compliance framework means to us and our company. Like, I think that would be kind of really pretty interesting.
I am going to tell my AI system to set a date 5 years from today where you and I will have a phone call and we'll figure out how true and accurate these predictions were. But thank you so much. Like, I really enjoyed these conversations with you, Robin. I'm looking forward to getting together with you over the summer at a couple different conferences. Thank you again for your time. For the audience out there, this has been a conversation with Robin Das from DataBee, a Comcast company. And yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate your time today.
Thanks for having me, Tyler.